Welcome back to the faraway application that we started building in the previous section. And now let's add some important state to the app and then also lift that state up. But before we start doing that, let's recap where we left off at the end of the previous section. So remember how we made our form here with these two controlled elements. So the state of these two elements is controlled here inside the form component with the description and the quantity state. Then, whenever this form here is submitted, the submit event will fire off. And so then we are handling that submit event here using the onSubmit prop with the handleSubmit function. So this function right here. Then, if there is a description, we create this new item object, which right now we are only logging to the console. So let's try that. And so you see, we got an object with a description, the quantity, the packed status set to false by default, and some random ID right here. Okay, but again, right now we are only logging this piece of information, so this new object here, to the console. But now let's do actually something else. So we want to store this information somewhere. And to help us with that, we can actually use the flowchart that we just looked at in the previous lecture. So we already know that we want to store some piece of information. Now, will that data, so that information, change at some point in the future? Well, yes, it definitely will each time that we add a new item to the items list. Now, can that data be computed from existing state or props? Well, no, it cannot. So therefore, we cannot derive state. Then the next question in our flowchart is whether this new data should actually re-render the component whenever it is updated. And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. And so therefore, as we already expected, the result of this first part of the flowchart is that we need to create a new piece of state in the component that we are currently building. And so with this, we finish the first half here of the flowchart, which is about when to create a new piece of state. Now back here in our code, let's actually do that. So let's create a new state variable called items. And then as always, we have our setter function, in this case called setItems. And so then use state. And now, what do you think will be the default value for this state variable? Well, remember that these items here are basically the packing items that are displayed here in the UI. And so this, remember, is an array. And therefore, our initial state for the items is just an empty array. So when we open up a new packing list, so when we open up this app for the first time, of course, we don't want to have any items. And so that's what the empty array here basically is. Okay, and so now let's actually use the setItems function here to add our new items to the items array. And actually let's do that in a separate function. And let's call that handle add items. And this function will receive a new item object, which it will then add to the items array. So let's actually immediately call the function here. So here we will call handle add items and then with the new item that we just create. So for example, with an item that looks just like this. So that's what we pass in here. And now, again, it's time to use setItems to update our items array. And this new items array will basically be the current items array plus the new item added to the end. And so what this means is that the new state depends on the current state. And therefore, here we now need to pass in a callback function. So not just a single value. So let's call the current state here in this callback items. And then here, let's see what we need to do. So remember that in React, we are not allowed to mutate state. So we cannot do this. So we can not simply push the new item into the items array, because with that, we would be mutating. So we would be changing this items array right here. And again, that's really not allowed in React. So React is all about immutability, and so the solution here is to create a brand new array which contains all the current items plus the new one. So let's return a new array, and then in there we simply spread the current items, and then we add another item which is simply called item. So the item that we are receiving here. Now if this looks strange to you, then please go back to the review of Essential JavaScript section, where I have a couple of videos on how to work with arrays in an immutable way. So basically how to add new items, how to update, and how to delete items from an array without mutating the original. So in React, that's something that we need to do all the time. And so again, if you're not sure how that works, then please go back to that section, because from now on, I will simply assume that you know how to do this. Okay, so this is already done. So we now have a way of adding new items to the state. And so let's immediately test that here. So let's use now 10 test items. And so we are still logging them to the console, but now I want to draw your attention here again to the DevTools. And in particular, of course, to the form component that we are working with now. And so down here, we already have our state, which already has this new item that we just created. Nice. So let's do another one for like boarding passes. And you see, immediately it got also added to our items array. So our updating logic here is working just fine. But of course, this state is now nowhere being displayed in the UI yet, right? So we are not using this items variable anywhere in our JSX yet. And the reason for that is that actually we do not need these items in this current component. The only goal of the form component is to add new items to this array, but not to render it. Instead, remember that who renders these items is actually the packing list component. So that's this one here, right? But with this, we now created ourselves a problem. So let's take a closer look here at the component tree. So right now, our item state is here inside the form component, right? And so this is where we update the state. However, we need the state itself, so we need this item state variable here in the packing list, because again, this is where it should actually be rendered onto the UI. And so now, how do we get this state from the form to the packing list? Well, we cannot pass it as a prop, because the form is not a parent component of packing list. It is simply a sibling component. But data can only flow down the tree. It cannot flow up the tree or sideways. So therefore, we cannot simply pass these items to the packing list via props. Instead, we now need to use a technique that I mentioned before, which is to lift up state. So what we're going to do now is to take this state here, so this line of code, and we will move it to the closest common parent component. So which one is that? Well, it's simply the app component, right? So this component is both a parent of the form and of the packing list, which are the two components which need this state. So again, let's grab this and let's move to our app and add the state right there. And then of course we get these errors here because setItems is no longer defined in the form. So let's fix that in a minute, but I want to start by now passing the items here into the packing list. So we define a new prop called items into which we pass the items array. All right, then let's come to the packing list and accept that prop there. So remember, we can immediately destructure the props object here. And then instead of the initial items, we will now finally render the actual items. And with this, we have now used the item state in our JSX, right? And now let's take care here of this handle add items function. So actually I will grab this entire function and move it here. And so now all we have to do in order to enable the form to update the state is to pass in this handle add items function. So let's do that. Let's create a new prop, and kind of a convention is to call this now on add items, handle add items. So we could of course call it the exact same prop name here. So we could create a prop called handle add items and then pass it a function with the same name, but it's kind of a convention for it to be like this. So it then becomes a bit more readable, like on add items, call handle add items. So if that makes sense. And then here, let's accept that on add items. And finally, here we now need to call, of course, the function with this prop. So with this prop name, on add items. And with this, we fixed all the errors that we had, but probably what we just did here is quite a bit confusing. So let me first now add a new item here, just to see if it works, and then I will explain what's actually happening a bit better. So let's see, and there it is. So we created a new item here. It was then added into the item state, which now lives in the app. Let's check that. Yep, that's right. Here it is. And so then that state got passed down here into the packing list, which received it as a props. And we can see that right here also in the DevTools. So here we now have the items as a prop, and then of course that gets rendered to the UI. Let's try another one, and immediately it got added here to the, well, to this state right here, which was then passed down into the packing list. And now about updating the state, this is what happened. So we now have our handle add items function right here in the app, which is exactly where the piece of state also lives. So where we have the home of the items state. And so all the logic about updating that state is here in the same component. However, it is the form that is actually responsible for creating new items. And so therefore, we need to give this component, so this form component here, access to a function that can update the state. And so that function is handle add items. So as I mentioned before, we can actually pass anything as a prop. And so that includes functions. So here we pass in handle add items as a prop, and we call that prop on add items, which of course, again, could also be called handle add items, which some people prefer, but many times you will see this convention. So then we come here, destructure the props, and then we call that function whenever the form is submitted. And that's it. So this is how we lift up state. So basically what that means is that whenever multiple sibling components need access to the same state, we move that piece of state up to the first common parent component, which again in our case here was the app component. All right, and we will actually review this one more time in the next lecture. But for now, let's move back to our flowchart and quickly complete it. So basically, we will just review what we just did and then see how we would have arrived at that solution here with the flowchart. So the new state that we created, was it only used in the initial component, so only used in the form? No, it was not. So then we move here and we ask ourselves, is the state also needed by a child component? And again, the answer is no, because instead it was needed by a sibling component. And so therefore, that is how we lifted state up to the first common parent. All right, so make sure to take another look at the code that we just wrote, and then in the next video, we will take an even closer look at this concept of lifting up state.